Hello and welcome to Modern JavaScript Week 2. So this week we're going to do something similar that we did last week. The problem is that JavaScript is a combination of a lot of things. So what I want to do is I want to show a more, complete example that builds off of what we talked about in the HTML and CSS class. I want to make the to-do application just a little bit more functional. And we'll see how far we can get with making it actually start to work for us and perform logic. Because as it stood with the HTML and CSS class, it just presented us a user interface, but we didn't actually add any logic to it. So I'm going to start off with just writing out the DOM. And I'm going to, in this example, I'm going to toss in a style sheet that's going to be referenced externally, which I'll be writing for you guys. And the actual style sheet isn't all that really important, but I do want it to get, I want it to look kind of like what we had going on with the HTML and CSS class. But once I get the DOM in place, or at least the markup for my HTML document, we're going to be taking a look at two things. The first one is we really want to have JavaScript able to assess the markup of the page and attach event handlers to the markup that already exists. In addition, we also want JavaScript to be able to handle events for objects that are created dynamically, because that's a very common thing we do in JavaScript is, well, we create elements. So, like I said before, let's go ahead and start off with linking in an external style sheet. I'm just going to say link rel equals style sheet with an href of styles.css. And then I'm going to go ahead and create that file by jumping into this folder, creating a new file called styles.css, and putting it in our editor. So as far as the markup for this, I'm just going to have the bits of the markup that are going to represent the elements that have behavior. So I'm not going to worry about the other aspects of the markup that we talked about in the HTML and CSS class, because this class is, well, mostly about JavaScript. So I'm going to start off with creating a div, give it a class of lists, and then within this div I'll create a section called today, and inside of today I'm going to place a UL and an H1. H1 is going to be the header for this section, which I'm going to say to do today. And the UL is going to have a few different items in it. I'm going to have, let's say, an item 1 and an item 2. And for both of these elements, I'm going to place an A tag inside of it. This A tag is going to have just an X to represent marking this item as complete. So now that I have the basic structure for my to-do today list done, with the exception of the add button, I'm going to add another button up here with just a plus symbol to be what we click on to add a new element to our list. I'm going to add in our other lists. So I have our today, I'm going to have our tomorrow, and I'm going to add in our future. And they're all going to follow pretty much the exact same markup. So let's go ahead and style it just really quickly, just so we can get some visual elements going on the screen. If we looked at what the page rendered to right now, it would look, well, fairly simple because we don't have any styling. And let me just go ahead and toss in some quick styles to get that going. I'm going to say lists section. I'm going to give them all a width of 33.33%. I'm going to give it a box sizing of border box, and a padding of 10 pixels, and a float of left. So that'll give us a nice little 3-column layout right there. So now that we have that rendered out, I guess I could go ahead and at least style our lists just a little bit, because otherwise what I'm doing right now isn't incredibly important, other than to prove that elements will behave the same way in JavaScript regardless of the kinds of styles that we apply to them. But I think for now that should be good. The last thing I want to do with the markup is I want one element to be completed already. So I'm going to give one of these elements a class of completed, and then I'm going to style a completed element to look like this. I'm going to say text decoration equals strike through, or sorry, yeah, that's text decoration strike through. I'm either blind or just give it a color of red. I think there's a dash in there somewhere, but okay, so we have our basic page up. Now, very commonly what we do with JavaScript with web applications is we already have some data presented to the user, but we also need to have that data be represented somewhere within our code, because our code needs to know if an item is completed or not. It also needs to know which one of these lists that item is contained within. So it's very common with JavaScript for us to assess what the current document object model looks like, and we can see an example of what it looks like right here by opening up our developer tools, and to turn this into what's typically referred to as a model of some kind, some sort of representation within our code to keep track of our data. So the first thing we got to do is assess what's already on the page. Then we can start adding dynamic behavior to it. So to do that, I'm going to throw in a script. Now, it's important. I'm actually going to do something interesting here. I'm going to say script source equals scripts.js. And what that's going to do is that's going to pull in an external script, just like what we have here on line 7 where we pulled in an external style. The very, very important thing to understand about importing an external script is that you must have a start tag and an end tag. Unlike the link element, which we can have a self-closing tag, or omit that if we wanted to, because HTML5 actually doesn't necessitate that this is self-closing. With JavaScript, we always must have a start script tag and an end script tag. If it were a self-closing script tag, it's not going to work on most browsers. So now that we've imported in a scripts.js, I got to actually create scripts.js. You'll also notice another interesting thing that I want to point out here. You see that I've imported the script actually at the bottom of my document, and that's generally what you would always want to do with JavaScript. The reason for that is that browsers will halt the execution of your web page while they are executing a script. Now you might think that's kind of silly to do, but if you actually think about it, it makes sense because scripts can alter everything. They can alter the style of your page, they can insert elements and remove elements and all that fun stuff. So a browser needs to halt its execution until a script is entirely processed. That means that in order to present the user with data as fast as possible, we want to make sure that all of our scripts are loaded at the end of our page. Now there are new additions to HTML that allow us to actually load in scripts asynchronously. There are also third-party libraries that allow us to do so. But if you don't have access to those features or those external libraries, you really should just be including your scripts at the bottom of the page. Okay, so now what I want to do is, again, like I said, I want to loop through these elements and I want to identify what's in them and turn it into something that's represented in code. Specifically, I want to create 3 arrays. I want to create today, tomorrow, and future, and I want each of these 3 arrays to have objects inside of them that represent the items. In addition, I also need to attach event handlers onto these A tags so that I know when an element is, or when you press the X button, for example, to finish off an item or to mark it as completed. So I'm going to start off with declaring 3 variables. I'm going to create a to-do today variable, which is going to equal an empty array. I'm going to create a to-do tomorrow variable, which is going to equal an empty array, and a to-do future variable, which is going to equal an empty array. Now, you'll notice some interesting aspects about the syntax. First of all, I am using the var keyword. With JavaScript, using the var keyword for virtually all of your variables is important, because if you don't, what happens is those variables are attached to a global object and could very well potentially expose the items in your scripts to other scripts and would result in collisions. Now, there are other ways to handle this at a global level. We'll talk about those next week. But for now, when working with the global scope, which we see an example of right here, or working with local function variables, we always want to use the var keyword. Second, I'm using commas. And all of these commas, this really does is it makes it so I don't have to type in var every single variable. Because I do want that var to be present for all of these variables to make sure we don't collide with other scopes, but I don't want to type it in all the time, and so I only have to do it once, and I can delineate the rest of my variable definitions with commas. The final thing to talk about here is we have these variables equaling these empty square brackets. And what that does is it creates an empty JavaScript array. That's because I want all three of these variables to be arrays. Now, like I said before, I want all three of these variables to be arrays that have objects inside of them that represent our DOM. And in addition, I need to attach event handlers to each one of my sections. So I need to attach an event handler for my plus buttons and my X buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a function called, establish list that takes in a list type. Now, this is a function that takes in a parameter, and the parameter is called list type, and I'm going to use that because I can select out each one of these sections individually simply by referencing their class. So, for example, I could do section.class or section.tomorrow, and I can select out this particular section, and I can grab this A element. So, to establish a particular list, like I said, I got to do a couple things. First of all, one quick interact. Sorry about that. So, now what I have, again, I have a list type, which is going to be one of these classes, either today, tomorrow, or future. So what I need to do is I need to return the element that represents each one of these sections. So I'm going to say var section equals document, and I'm going to say query selector. And I'm going to say section dot plus list type. And then for now, I'm just going to say return section. The reason I'm doing this is I want to quickly test out this function, and I want to show that this function is available within our console. So what I can do is I can say establish list today, and what I get returned back to me is a element that represents that selector. So one quick note about this, notice how I'm not using get element by ID, I'm using query selector. And the query selector met function is a function that will return the first object or the first DOM element that matches whatever selector I passed into it. Now, query selector isn't supported on all browsers, unfortunately, but it is supported on all browsers if using something like jQuery, which we'll talk about very soon here next week. So for now, we're just going to be using the query selector because it really does allow us to do things that previously were very difficult to do within JavaScript. So the first thing I want to do when establishing a list is I want to attach an event handler to my plus buttons. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var add button equals section dot query selector, and I'm going to say h1a. And then let's return add button so we can test it here in our code, where I can say establish list today, and we get selected out our nice little element right there. So now I can attach an event handler right onto my A tag, and it'll be available to me. So now that I have my add button, the next thing I need to do is I need to return a list of all of the LIs that are within the section, because remember, each one of these LIs represents an item that needs to be done. So I'm going to say var to-do elements equals section dot query selector ulli, or whoops, query selector all. Now you'll notice that I've been adding in additional variable definitions as I'm going along. I'm going to take a step back here and refactor these to instead use the comma operator to make my code a little bit more succinct. Now it's very common when writing code in any language that you establish all your variables near the top of your function, and it makes your code just look a little bit cleaner. So now we have our add button and our to-do elements. So let's attach an event handler to our add button first. So let's go ahead and say add button on click equals function e dot prevent default, and then how about console.log adding element item 2, and then I can pass in list type. So now what I've done is if I invoke the established list on any one of my objects or on any one of my list types, I will have a on-click handler added to my add button. I'm going to slightly refactor my code up here between lines 1 and 3. And instead of saying to-do today equals empty array, I'm going to say to-do today equals established list today, tomorrow established list tomorrow, and future established list future. So now because I've ran all that code, we get these buttons that now do something. Alright, so how's everyone doing so far? We've now successfully added an event handler onto my buttons that allow me to insert a new item. So that's one of the first things I gotta do. But at this point, I also need to loop through each one of my to-do elements that are inside of this array. And for every item within the to-do elements, I need to detect its title, and I need to attach an event handler to its button that is responsible for marking it as completed. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say for var I equals 0, I smaller than to-do elements dot length I++. It's because to-do elements is an array of elements. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var to-do element equals to-do elements at I. And I'm going to add an event handler to my button. So I can say var complete button equals to-do element dot query selector A. And then I can say complete button dot on click equals function e dot prevent default, and then I can say console log completing item. But we're missing one important thing. The thing we're missing here is I need to extract, for each one of these LIs, I need to extract the text within it. So let's do a naive implementation of that first, and then I'll talk about later how we can fix this up, just so we can get some completing action going here. So I'm going to say item title equals, and at this point I'm just going to say to-do element dot inner HTML for now. Now that's not exactly what I want, but we'll get to what I want a little bit later. So now that I've extracted out the item's title, I can say completing item plus item title. And now we get a really good example of a problem. So what do you think is going to happen when I hit this X button? Anyone? Where do I create to-do elements? Or to-do elements is up here on line 8. It's an array that contains all of my LIs. Okay, so what do you think is going to happen if I hit this X button right here? What do you think is going to be printed out? So think about that real fast, because this runs into one of the most frustrating things about JavaScript. Why do you guys think that it says completing item 2? It's not that it's zero-based. So the problem we have right here is a very common issue that you're going to run into JavaScript with all of the time. JavaScript has very, very, very interesting scoping rules. What I mean by that is the variable we're actually looking at in item title, although it's defined as a var right here on line 16, this variable is actually not owned by the for loop. It is owned by this function. So why is that important? Well, it's important because this is one variable and it will only ever be one variable. And so when we loop over and over and over again, what we're going to get is, in fact, what I could do here is I could say, could make this maybe a little bit more explicit for you guys. I could say console.log and then I'll do section, or sorry, not section, I'll do to-do element. So make this very clear what's going on here, because this is something that, again, one of the things that makes teaching JavaScript very difficult. I hope you guys all appreciate that, because JavaScript is a very funky language. So if I hit X right here, look at what element is being highlighted. The item 2. If I click X right here, look at what's being highlighted, that one. And if I click X here, this one's being highlighted. No matter if I click item 1 or item 2, they both point to the same item 2. Now that's because a new scope is not being created when I enter a for loop. So for the invocation of established list, okay, so think about it like this. When I invoke established list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 variables get created. And all 6 of these variables are owned by the single invocation of established list. When I invoke established list again, 6 variables are created. And then when I invoke established list one more time, 6 variables are created. Even though I'm in a loop right here, these variables do not get created every time the loop is executed. Instead, what happens is we get a scoping issue where the variable referenced within this closure references the to-do element as of the last time the for each loop executes. So let me try to make this a little bit more clear. I'm going to try to focus or explain this to the best of my ability, because it's a very, very confusing topic. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say console.log, and I'm going to say starting loop for list type. And then I'm going to say ending loop for list type. So now when I refresh my page, we'll see in my console, starting loop for today, ending loop for today, starting loop for tomorrow, ending loop for tomorrow. See, all this loop, all this code executes immediately, but it's attaching on a function that's going to only be invoked when the onClick handler is fired on the individual complete buttons. Which means that the code on line 22 and 23 is executed after the loop has been finished. And we can prove that by looking at what's going on right here. To do today started and ended right there. But when I click on this X, it happens later. And because it happens later, the value of the to-do element variable has been overridden, because the next time the loop executes, it's going to change the value of this element. So how's everyone doing right now? To put it simply, these 6 variables that I've declared are all owned by this scope. So the item 2 from future to-do list, if I click on this X, I'll get the final item on the to-do today. If I click on this X, I'll get the last item on the to-do tomorrow. And if I click on this X, I'll get the final item of to-do future. That's because this function was invoked 3 times. Because this function was invoked 3 times, it created 3 separate scopes. One scope contained everything for today, one scope contained everything for tomorrow, and one scope contained everything for the future. So how does it know which scope to execute when you click on the X? Because I attached this event handler during an execution of established list, it will use this scope. But this scope gets ran 3 times, one for today, one for tomorrow, and one for future. Which means because it gets created 3 times, I get 3 different sets of variables. So with JavaScript, again, this is a very, very common, ridiculously, insanely common problem. And you will run into it repeatedly. And unfortunately, I mean, if it doesn't make sense, that's okay, because it is a very complex issue, but I'm trying to explain it to the best of my ability. Can I put the event handlers outside of the function? Well, I wouldn't be able to, because I'm attaching the event handlers to the specific elements based off of the list type. Remember, I have 3 lists, today, tomorrow, and future. So I invoke this function 3 times. If I did it outside of the function, we would run into the exact same problem. What I need to do is I need to create a new scope every time this loop executes. It needs to result in an entirely new scope. Now, there's a few ways that I can do this. Unfortunately, none of them are particularly clean. What would cause it not outputting anything in the log? If you're not invoking the function, then it won't print anything out to the log, and if you're not including the script into your HTML document. You need to make sure that you include your scripts at some point in your HTML document for it to execute at all. Okay, so again, just to recap, just hopefully if I say this enough times, it'll start to make sense. In JavaScript, functions create scope, which means that these 3 variables and these 3 variables are all in the same scope. Which means when I reference to-do element, I'm referencing a to-do element that is attached to the function, which means that this code, because it executes after everything is done, after this loop is done, to-do element is always going to be equal to the last thing it was set to. For example, I could say at the end of this, I could say to-do element equals whoa, which would actually require that I don't believe this is going to work the way I want it to. Oh, there we go. It's not something I've ever done before, but again, as you can see here, the local variable or the local variable definitions really do get attached to the function, which allows me to say to-do element equals whoa, and because I overrode it, then it's that. So whatever to-do element equals by the time this function executes will be what is in there inside that function. And I can prove that by, let's say I added a bunch more items. I said item 3, item 4, and item 5. And if I hit this X, I get a reference to item 5, because that is the value of the variable after the function is done running. So how do we fix this? Well, there's quite a few different ways to fix this. But they're not all that pretty. One of them is a recent addition to JavaScript, and it is array.forEach. What's important about forEach is that the forEach function will open up an entirely new scope for us. Now, one quick note about forEach. forEach is not going to work in older versions of Internet Explorer, but it is something that will work with jQuery if we were using it. So bear in mind that, yes, these are new features of JavaScript, which is why this is called modern JavaScript and not legacy JavaScript. So let's go ahead and figure out how we can do that. So I'm going to say todo elements dot for each, and I'm going to pass in a function. And that function is going to be a function that takes in an element. There's a variety of things that you can pass in into for each. The callback, I mean, but the first item is always going to be item. So for example, if I said console.log item, and I reran this example, blah, 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 node list doesn't have for each, apparently. It needs to be in an actual array for whatever reason, which again is why using jQuery is better. So let's go ahead and turn my todo elements into a array so that I can use the for each function. Again, we won't have to worry about this next week, so just bear with me really fast. I'm going to remove some of my extraneous console.logs. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say var elements equals array for var I equals 0, I smaller than todo elements dot length I plus plus elements dot push todo elements at I, and then I can say elements dot for each function e console log e. And I get a list of all of my elements. Which unfortunately it's not doing the little highlighting trick right there, but that's okay. We don't need that. Okay, so now I have a for each going on. So what makes this for each different than the array, the for loop that I used to have? Can anybody tell me? What makes this for each different than the for loop? All right, well, yeah, I'm passing in a function. And the great thing about that is this function opens up a new scope, which means this e variable is in a new scope. I'm going to rename this element just to make it a little bit more clear. And then I'm going to prove that it's opening up a new scope by doing element dot on click equals function. And I'm going to say var title equals element dot inner HTML. And I'm going to say up here in my on click, I'm going to say e dot prevent default. And I'm going to say console log completing title. So now you see that everything is behaving the way that it should. Now, the reason everything is behaving the way that it should is because with the for each function, I am passing in a function. Remember, with JavaScript, we can use functions as variables. So because I'm passing in a function, I can open up a new scope, or rather I am opening up a new scope, which means that this, every time that this is executed, I get a new scope, which means this element variable is going to reference each element without any regard to what we had before going on with our for each or for loop. Every time the for each function goes to the next element, it opens up a new scope and gives us this element to work with, which means this element is, no matter where we are executing the code, whether that's in the future, like what we're doing right now, or not, the element will always point to the element that it was pointing to when the for each loop got to that point. So I'm going to wrap this up one more time and I'm going to show you guys an implementation of for each if we wanted to write our own. It's really simple. All I got to do is say function for each our callback, and I can say for var I equals 0, I smaller than r length, I plus plus, and I can say callback r at I. Which means I can clean up my code a little bit more by, instead of having to alias this out into its own array, so I can gain access to the for each function, because right now the for each function only works on arrays. Again, it's not something you would need to worry about if you were using jQuery, but still, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rewrite this code by simply saying for each elements, and then I'm going to pass in that function. And when I said elements, I meant to say to-do elements. And now we see an example of us creating a new scope. Okay, so how many people are still having difficulties here? I mean, it's okay if you guys are. Okay, and we're back. So, again, just a really quick recap. What we have going on here is we have an established list function. That function takes in a list type. The type is correlated to our classes that we've attached to our sections. The goal of established list is to identify the current markup in this list, turn it into JavaScript objects, and to attach event handlers to all of the DOM elements, such as our plus button right there and our X buttons right here. So when I invoke established list on each three of my lists, my to-do today, tomorrow, and future, what I get is a new scope. And that scope here starts up here on line 6 and ends on line 22. Inside of the scope, I first retrieve the section. The section is the document or the element that is selected by the selector of section.list type. So for today, it'll be section.today, tomorrow will be section.tomorrow, and so on and so on. The next thing I do is I retrieve my add button. My add button I pull out by selecting H1A. Notice though how in order to determine the correct A tag that I'm grabbing for my add button, I invoke query selector not on document but on section. What that does is it scopes my query selection to that particular DOM element. The last thing I do is I retrieve all of my elements out of the ULLI that's underneath the section. Or sorry, all the elements out of the UL. So I'm selecting all of the LIs underneath the UL, underneath the section. So you can look at this selector right here as being section.list type space UL space LI. And that will get us to the element that we want to use. Okay, then I do something relatively straightforward. I add an onClick handler to my add button, and I set it to a function that 1, prevents the default behavior of the browser, and 2, logs something out to the console. Then I invoke my forEach function. So jumping all the way down really quickly to the definition of forEach is a function that takes in an array and a callback. Then what it does is it loops through everything in the array with a standard for loop, and it invokes the callback, passing in the value that we're currently looking at in the array. Now, callback is actually going to be a function, which again allows us to invoke it, but it's a function that we're treating as a variable, which is a very powerful feature of JavaScript. By invoking that function, we are opening up a new scope. That allows us to loop through each one of our items in our to-do elements and generate a new scope for every item, which means that our element parameter in our callback function is always going to be pointing to the correct element. Which means when we close over any of the variables inside of this block, such as title, it captures the variable that's unique to each iteration of the for each loop. So remember, callback is just a reference to a function. So for example, if I wanted to talk really quickly about how we can use functions as data, I can write a function called do things that takes in a parameter called callback. Callback could be named anything. And I'm going to say callback 20, 30, 50, 60. And now I can invoke do things, and I can say do things function item console log item. So what's going on here is, again, I'm treating a function as data. I'm passing in a function definition as an argument into another function. And that other function is then invoking my callback for every single item, or for the values of 20, 30, 50, and 60. Which means that if I were to run this code, I would get 20, 30, 50, and 60, because that's what my doThings function is doing. So does the concept of a callback function make sense? I mean, a callback, the idea of a callback isn't something that's built into the language. Like, there's no keyword called callback. Like, I could name this whatever I wanted to. But to say that something's a callback is to say that we are passing a function into another function, and that other function decides when the function we passed in gets invoked. Which is to say, we could think of our add button on click as being a form of a callback. I mean, it basically is. We're assigning a function to the on click handler, which means that whatever function we passed in is not going to be invoked until that handler is executed. Which is why in our for each right here, we pass in not only the array that we want to loop over, but we also pass in a function. And that function is going to be applied for every item within Todo elements. Now, the reason we have to do this is because of scope. We need to be able to open up a new scope every time we iterate over any of the elements within Todo elements. Otherwise, we'll run into the situation that we ran into before. All right, so how's everyone doing? Alrighty, so now that we have our callback here done, where if I click on one of these X's, I'll get completing item 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5. Let's really quickly introduce something that is kind of confusing, but just something you've got to memorize. Notice how each one of these items are including my A tag, which isn't really the behavior that I want. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the console window to show you guys how we can retrieve just the text of an element. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to select out an element. I'm going to say var elem equals document.query selector, and I'm going to select the first A tag that appears within an li. Just for testing. Whoops. Oh, right. It's always going to return undefined because of the, there we go. Okay. So right now, this is just for demonstration purposes. I'm showing you guys inside of my, console window, just so we can look at some of the properties we have on objects, or on elements. So everybody good with the fact that there's now an elem variable that points to my first X right there? Everyone good with that? All right, we have a couple properties we can use. I can say elem.inner HTML. Whoops, I meant to get the first li. Derp. There we go. I meant to get the whole li. There we go. Okay, so now we have an element or a variable that points to that li. I can say elem.inner HTML. I can get that. I can say outer HTML. I can get that. So the inner HTML returns the HTML that is inside of the element, which includes that X, that A tag. Because as you see, the A element appears within the li. Next up, we have the outer HTML. The outer HTML not only includes what's inside of it, but it also includes the HTML that's outside of it. Now, what's cool about inner HTML and outer HTML is we can modify them. I can say inner HTML equals blink hey. And now I get a blink tag right there, which is not blinking because I don't think blink tags are supported anymore. So I can modify the inner HTML and the outer HTML to whatever I want, which is really cool. So let's go ahead and redo that real fast to get rid of the blink tag. Get element by, whoops, query selector, li. Okay, now I can also do inner text, which this is interesting because inner text, it does retrieve the text of the item, but you also notice that it retrieves the text of its children as well. So, you guys want to know something crazy? Remember how I've been referring to each one of these elements as nodes? So they're nodes in the DOM. Remember, the DOM is the document object model, which is what the browser currently sees. The DOM was created from the HTML, but we can modify it with JavaScript. Now, we also have, the DOM contains elements or nodes, and it contains them in a hierarchy, which we can see represented graphically here, where we have an A tag inside of an LI tag, blah, blah, blah. Well, this text is actually a node. It's a text node, which means to retrieve the text out of this item, we have to retrieve the value of this text node. Now, see how I did lm.innerText and I even got the X right there? The reason I got that is because inner text returns all of the text nodes, not only immediately inside of the element, but also within it. So what we need to do is I'm actually going to say inner text dot, whoops, there we go. I'm going to say first child. So lm.firstChild is going to retrieve the text of item 1. This is actually a node. Specifically what I want is firstChild.value, or blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean. You see what happens when you use jQuery for so long? .text. What do you mean by that? We can go ahead and look at lm first child. We can look at just the different properties that it has. So again, we have a bunch of normal stuff like node name, node type. If I did node type, we get a node type of 3, which is the node type of text. But we have a variety of functions that look pretty much exactly like our normal elements. So what we want is we want our node value. There we go. I knew it was value something. See? I know how to code. What we want is our node value. And the node value of a text node will return just the text within it. So I'm literally selecting this node right here that I've highlighted. Even though this node isn't technically what I would consider to be an element, as it's not like, you know, an LI tag or a UL tag or whatever, it still is a node within our DOM, and we still have to treat it as such. Wow, you pretty much have to memorize the JavaScript APIs. Yeah, pretty much, which is why it's why doing the stuff on the fly is kind of stressful sometimes, because there's a whole lot of stuff to memorize. But remember, your developer tools are your friends, or is your friend, or you know what I mean, words. Anyway, so what we got going on here is I can do firstChild.nodeValue, which will retrieve this node. Now, it's important to realize, though, that if I had reversed this in the DOM, which for some reason is not going to let me do, There we go. If I had reversed this, I would get a node type of 1, which means element, and a node value of null. That's because the first child is now this A tag. So I want to point out that it is this way of doing this is kind of flaky, but we will be looking at better ways to retrieve text from our DOM next week when we look at JavaScript or jQuery. But the important thing to understand at this point is the reason why I have to do firstChild.nodeValue to get the text, and that is because text is technically a node within our DOM. So what I'm going to do here is instead of title equals element.innerHTML, I'm going to say firstChild.nodeValue. And now when I bring back my code, if I hit this X button, it says completing item 1, completing item 2, item 3, item 4, and item 5. So that's really cool. But what happens when we complete something? What do we want to happen? Well, I want the class called completed to be added to the LI. That's really it for now. I mean, I could go all crazy and have it post to some sort of API, but that's obviously not going to be within scope here. So let's look at how we can do that. And let's do that from within our developer console. Again, when exploring JavaScript, the development console is your friend. So we have elem, and elem has a class name, and it's going to have a class list. The class name is what we want to modify. I mean, for example, if we had completed item, and we did class name, we would get completed space item. So if I wanted to change the class name, I would do elem.className equals completed. And that changes the class. You guys see how that's working? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come back here, and instead of saying completing item, I'm going to say element.className equals completed. So now when I come back here and hit these X buttons, notice how these items are now turning red. So we can see that because if I look at this, so watch this right here that I have highlighted here in my developer tools. If I click this X, class completed gets added on. And the reason it does that is because of this class name. Now, as far as what to do when this actually happens, there's a variety of things that we could do when we complete an item. One of them is we could use CSS to hide the button entirely. So for example, if I come back to styles.css and I say lists ulli.completed a display none, what that'll do is it'll hide the buttons when I complete the item. So how's everyone feeling about that? Alrighty, so before we go on break here, I want to finish one more thing. I want to finish the addition of an item. So instead of just adding a console thing saying adding item to today or tomorrow, I want to have it pop up with a little box that lets me type in an item and have it appended to my DOM for the list. So the first thing I want to do is I need a reference to my UL, because I'm going to be adding in an additional LI element onto the UL. So to do that, I'm going to say list equals section.querySelector UL. So that's going to find the UL inside of my section. Then on add button.onClick, I need to create a new element, and I need to attach that element to my list. So I'm going to say var list item equals document.createElement li. Then I'm going to say title equals window.prompt enter to do item. Then I'm going to say list item.inner HTML equals title. And then I'm going to go ahead and say list.append child list item. So now when I come back here and say plus enter something, we have a list item being added. So again, just to back up real fast, what we have going on here is the first thing we need to do is get a reference to our actual UL element. We need that reference because we're adding items to it. To do that, I'm just saying section.querySelector UL. Remember, the section element is going to be different every time established list is invoked. The first time it's invoked, it's going to be the section that it has the class of today. The second time it's invoked, it's going to have the section with class of tomorrow, and so on. So when I do section.querySelector UL, I'm retrieving the UL that's specific to the section I'm looking at. Now that I have that out in a variable, on my add button on click handler, I'm preventing the default behavior, then I'm creating a list item by doing document.createElement li. So I'm creating a new element. I'm not attaching it to the DOM yet, but I'm creating it. And then I'm establishing my title. And I'm setting my title to a function called window.prompt, or an invocation of window.prompt. Now when you invoke window.prompt, a dialog box pops up and lets us type in text. Now next week, once we get into more fun stuff with jQuery, we'll be talking about how we can have a actual modal dialog box come up that we can style with HTML and CSS, but for now we're just using the basic window.prompt functionality. Then we're setting title to list item.inner HTML, and then we're appending the list item child to our list. Now, we're missing one more thing. As you see here, our X button does not magically appear. Now, there's a few ways we can do this. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to create a new element called complete button. I'm going to say document.createElement a. Then I'm going to say, after I set the inner HTML of list item, I'm going to say complete button dot set attribute href pound. Then I'm going to say complete button dot inner HTML equals x. Then I'm going to say list item dot append child complete button. I'm actually going to go ahead and add a space right there. That'll look a little bit nicer. There we go. So now we have this A tag being added into the DOM right there. Now we're doing that in a bit of a roundabout way. I could have completely not... I didn't even have to do the create element here is what I'm saying. What I could have done instead is I could have done this. Straight up into the list item.inner HTML, I could have added the HTML for the A tag. But does anybody have an idea of why instead I manually created the element, I manually set its attribute, I manually set its inner HTML, and then I added it to the list item? Does anybody have an idea why I might have done that for the code? More control is pretty close, but there's a specific reason. Well, there's a specific thing that I need more control about, is what I'm saying. And the next person kind of gets it by asking about the onClick handler. The reason is I need to attach an onClick handler to my button. No, I don't need to attach the complete button to my list. I need to attach it to my list item. Because if I didn't do list item.append child complete button, then I would be creating the element, but I would never be attaching it to anything. So I need to attach it to my LIs. But anyway, the reason I opted to go the little bit more verbose way of doing this is because I need to add a onClick handler to my button every time I create one. But the problem with that is that if I had created the A tag by using the inner HTML, I would have to select the A tag back out again, which would be redundant and annoying and the code would look gross. So instead I just did it this way. Now, I kind of cheated with the text node. Instead of manually creating a text node, which you can do, by the way, it's just kind of ugly, so I'm kind of cheating here. I'm just saying inner.html equals text, and that'll create the text node for me, so I don't have to create a text node, which there is a function called create text node if you really want to go crazy into this. But this is just a nice little shorthand for the text node. But when it comes to the A tag, I want that to be in its own variable so that I can add the onClick handler to it. Okay, so what I can do here is, now that I've done all this stuff, I can say complete button.onClick equals function e.preventDefault list item.class name equals completed. So now if I come back to my code and I add another item and again, I can now complete them. So there we have a fairly mostly functional system here, which is really neat. Now somebody did ask about, or somebody did notice the ridiculous amounts of, or the obvious case of code repetition. I'm actually going to leave that for after break, because the way that I'm going to solve this code duplication problem is going to blow everybody's brains out and leave a massive mess. So yeah, I'll talk about removing this code duplication after break. For now, let's do one more fun little thing real fast. I'm going to say, I always like, whenever, I find CSS to be a really fun language to work with. So whenever I'm working on some crazy JavaScript, it's always nice just to sit back and play around with some CSS for a second. So I'm going to do like that, and then the LIs, they're going to have like a padding, or how about a border bottom of 1 pixel dashed dark gray or something, and a padding of 3 pixels. And then let's give them an overflow of hidden, so that I can do lists lia, give you a display of block and a float of right, a background of dark gray, a foreground of light gray, a padding of 3, margin top of -3. And that actually looks really ugly. But still. Yeah, that actually really does look really ugly. Whatever. The point is, we now have a dynamic web page, and if you want to fiddle around with the styles more, I'm sure anybody can do a better job than what I just did. Font awesome. Yeah, that would make it look a lot nicer too, wouldn't it? Anyway, I could seriously be here all day just styling this application. There, that looks a lot nicer, doesn't it? I mean, it still looks horrible, but... sorry. There we go. Alright, so I think that's about it as far as the styling goes. Except for that one thing. So let's go ahead and look back at our code and figure out what exactly is wrong with it, because we do have one issue. Actually, we have two issues. Sorry guys, I introduced a slight bug into the program. I'm attaching the on-click handler that for existing items, I'm attaching it to the element itself and not the actual button. So instead of doing element.onClick, I got to do element.querySelectorA.onClick. So that way you have to actually click on the button. So sorry about that, guys. But there's one more problem with it. And the one more problem with it is going to the solution to this problem, or the solution that I'm going to use, is going to be crazy because it's going to blow everybody's minds. Like, seriously, I'm not even kidding. So, in light of that, I'm going to go ahead and give everyone a break, a chance to breathe, and pause the video. Okay, and we're back. So, we left off with trying to figure out how we can get rid of the duplication here with our click handlers. There's two ways to do this. Now, I'm going to leave the crazy way to last because that introduces a concept, or more specifically a technique that you can use in JavaScript to do some awesome things. But I'll break things up a little bit differently. I'm going to start off with the simpler implementation. And the simpler implementation would be something like, let's say I'm going to add a function down here. I'm going to say function add click handler element, and then I'm going to say element.querySelectorA dot on click equals function e dot prevent default element.class name equals completed. So basically I took attaching the event handler and I put it into my own function. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this code so that all I'm doing is I'm saying add click handler to element. I actually no longer need the title anymore. So I can just say add click handler element, and then I can also use this code up here by saying add click handler list item. And now when I come back to my code, the click handler works on the existing elements, and it also works on the new items. So again, the only interesting thing really about this code is that I'm declaring a function within a function, which is perfectly valid code in JavaScript. And you do this when you want the function to be not available to anybody else, because the add click handler really only matters inside of the established list function. So I put it inside of the established list function to prevent other people from accessing this code. Is everybody okay with this code right here? Doesn't need any more explanation. Okay, so you guys ready for the crazy way to do this? Let's write, so I'm going to undo all that. Let's write a function that returns a function. So I'm going to say function create complete handler element return function e dot prevent default element dot class name equals completed. So right here, I have a function that returns another function. And this is something you will do very commonly in JavaScript once you start working with more complex programs. So to invoke this function, all I gotta do is I gotta say element query selector A on click equals, and then I invoke create click handler for element. I can do the same thing right here too. I can say create click handler for a list item. And so now we see an example of that code working. So what's going on here, again, is I have a function, and when I invoke the function, it returns another function. Oops, I should probably have a semicolon right there. So, again, this is pretty crazy what we have going on here. You will see a lot of code that actually does things like this in JavaScript you may read. Understanding exactly what's going on here isn't technically necessary, but I really want to stress the fact that functions are really just data. And when I say they're data, that means they can be returned, and they can also be passed in as parameters. So there's one more thing that I want to talk about with returning functions. What do you guys think the output of this program is going to be, now that I've broken function out into its own line? Can anybody guess what this output is going to be? Or what's going to happen? Well, you'd think it's the same, but guess what? My onClick handler no longer works. Now, I could look at my code, and I have an uncaught, I have a syntax error right here on line 35. Now, the reason for this actually calls back to something that I mentioned in passing last week. Can anybody think of what this could, or what could be causing this problem? Yeah, it's about semicolons. See, JavaScript doesn't require the use of semicolons, which means that if JavaScript sees a return statement with nothing on the same line, what it does is it actually inserts a terminator. Because JavaScript doesn't require semicolons, it sees return and it says, okay, well, because you have nothing else on that line, I'm going to assume that what you have going on here is a simple return statement that returns nothing. So because that we have a return statement with the semicolon being added in by the JavaScript parser, this code right here on line 35 is completely ignored. And what gets returned is undefined. And it's technically appropriate to assign a click handler to undefined, but nothing will happen. So whenever you're returning a function or an object or anything, remember to always have that thing be on the same line as the return keyword, otherwise JavaScript will ignore it. Okay, so remember, let's do something else. I'm going to take this function, I'm going to put it in the global scope. The reason I'm going to do that, I wonder what's... Okay, so now my code works. If I look at... Let's talk about functions returning of functions for a second. If I say create complete handler, I get function create complete handler return function. Now if I invoke create complete handler with something, what I get returned back is a new function. So I'm just trying to stress the fact that what this create complete handler function does is when I invoke it, it creates a new function. Which means I could technically do something like this if I wanted to. Now this is going to cause an error because executing that callback without the appropriate things being set will cause an error, but still. So remember, a function returning a function allows us to invoke the thing that's returned. Just like if I wonder if I can do this. Function add right return function left return right plus left. Ret run, really? There we go. So I created a function called add. Add returns a function, which means if I look at add, we get this. If I invoke add with 5, we get this. If I invoke add with 5 and then 10, we get 15. That's because, again, the add function returns a function, which means I can go ahead and say invoke add with 5, and I get a function back, and then I invoke that with 10, and I get 15. So for people who are maybe unclear about functions returning functions, is that kind of making sense? And we get silence. So probably not. It's not super important that you guys understand this. It will be something that the more you see of it and the more you use, it'll become a little bit more clear. As far as other examples, let's say I created a function that took in an element, and then it returns a function that takes in text, and then it sets element.innerHTML to that text. Actually, let me go ahead and write this out in the actual code so that you can see its syntax highlighted. So I'm going to move all of this down here. I'm going to say function, I forgot to name the function. Do something, and do something returns a function that takes in text, and then it takes the element and it does that. Okay, so there's my function that returns a function. So I can invoke I can look at do something. If I just look at do something, I get the entire output of that. If instead I did do something document.querySelector section, let me do that. Wow. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to invoke do something, and I'm going to pass in the first section element. Now, what I get returned, or what gets returned back to me is another function. Notice how nothing happened on my page at all. So let's go ahead and alias this out into a variable. So I'm going to alias it out into a ble variable. So now ble contains a function, kind of like a function pointer in C++ or a delegate in C#. And I can now invoke ble, which you see right up there. It changes the inner HTML of the element that I passed into the first invocation. And I can invoke this and have it say whatever I want. So remember, what I did was I can go ahead and say var alter tomorrow equals do something document.querySelector, and then I'm going to pass in section.tomorrow. What I've done is I've constructed a function. You can kind of think of it like instantiating an object in other languages. I've created a new function called alter tomorrow. The function alter tomorrow will change the inner HTML of the element that I passed in to do something. So now I can say alter tomorrow altered. And you see that that has now been changed. I've completely modified the DOM and removed all those elements. And then I can say var alter future equals do something document.querySelector section.future. And I can say alter future blah blah blah. But I can still say alter tomorrow if I wanted to. And I can still say alter future. So remember, notice how I'm aliasing out an invocation of do something into a variable, and then I'm invoking the variable as if it were a function, because it is a function. So for example, I could put this all on one line of code. I could say well, let me go ahead and refresh the page so we get our stuff back. I could say do something, passing in document.querySelector, passing in section.tomorrow. So this will select out this section right here. And then this will return a function which I can immediately invoke and say stuff. So if I hit enter, that function has been invoked because I'm immediately turning around and invoking that function. So what we have an example of here are a few really cool aspects of JavaScript programming. We have a closure, which this function is technically called a closure because we're closing over the element variable that's passed in. We're basically, you can think of it like, again, we're instantiating an object and we're gathering the data that was passed into the topmost function. Which means that I could do something like this. I could say function console log whoa, right? See, if I just did this, it would just return my function, but I can invoke it at the end if I wanted to, which will actually execute that internal function. So again, this is just something fun that I wanted to quickly throw up for you guys. Following along isn't necessarily required, but I did want to talk about it for a second. How's everyone doing with functions that return functions? It's okay if it's a little bit crazy, because it is kind of crazy. Why do you guys think someone might want to have a function inside of a function? Commonly. Now, we see an example already where I'm creating a complete handler, but not necessarily for the database. Well, let's correlate functionality coming from different locations. I'm not sure I know what you mean. Let's do something crazy. So, I created var console equals string. Does everybody see that? Up here? Okay, then I'm going to write a function, or no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go into my console window up here. I'm going to refresh. Then I'm going to write console.log whoa. What do you think the output to this program is going to be? Given that I have line 1 up there saying var console equals blah. Can anybody guess what the output of this program is going to be? Well, it's going to be an error. It says object question mark exclamation point has no method log. Can you guess why that happened? Well, console already is an object. Remember how console is that the console.log is how I log things out to the console. But what I've done is I've overridden console. So how do we fix this? Well, we fix this with a bit of really crazy syntax that may or may not make this example more clear. Okay, so the rest of the code doesn't matter. What I've done here is I have created a function without a name, an anonymous function, and I've immediately invoked it. basically, it would be like this. Var script equals blah, and then I invoke script. But I'll leave it to how you'll usually see it. What I'm doing is I'm creating an anonymous function. Whoops, why did I put that there? Sorry, I'm just so used to jQuery. I'm creating an anonymous function that is immediately invoked after it's declared. Now if I come back here and say console log whoa, it works. The reason it works is because by creating this function, I've created a new scope. Which means this console, because it's scoped locally with the var keyword, is not the same thing as the global console. So does this syntax maybe make a little bit more sense? I'm creating a function and I'm immediately invoking it. You'll see this done with, well, everything, actually. This is actually the common pattern of, or this is one form of a common pattern of writing all your JavaScript code. There's a little bit, there's other little bits to it that I'm not going to get into. But all this does is it creates us a new scope that allows us to do whatever. Like I could say var window equals blah. I can say var document equals whoa. You know, I can sit here and redefine every single global object. I can even say var undefined equals that if I wanted to. That will cause lots of problems. But the point is that because I'm invoking all of these variable definitions within a function, they won't override those values outside of the function, outside of the scope. So how does everyone feel about that? Now, of course, by doing this, I will break all of the code inside of the function. Notice how it says object whoa has no method query selector, but it doesn't affect any of the other values. Okay, so how's everyone doing? All right, so for homework, just like last week, I want people to reproduce obviously what we have on screen and go ahead and apply the same styles and stuff that we had before with the Todo application, or your own styles if you didn't go through those classes. And the reason is, again, I find styling very cathartic after writing a bunch of horrible JavaScript. So it's really important that people get comfortable with the idea of creating new elements, setting their inner HTMLs, appending children, setting click handlers, preventing the defaults, and so on and so on. And then next week, we'll start taking a look at jQuery. Which, again, somebody asked earlier, is jQuery better than JavaScript or something like that? But what I will go ahead and just define what it is so you guys know what we're going to be doing next week. jQuery is a library. It's a set of code that's written in JavaScript that gives us a lot of functionality that would make the code we're looking at right here a lot cleaner. In fact, one of the things that we're going to be doing is rewriting this code using jQuery. It's Link. Actually, it provides a lot of similar functionality to Link. All right, there's two more things I want to talk about. First of all, these objects up here. The reason I initially put these up is I wanted to have the established list function return objects that could be used to control the lists, but we never got to a point today where I would actually use that functionality. So I just wanted to point that out, where it's not necessary to create those variables. In fact, if you wanted to, you could have simply just done this. Or if you wanted to go really crazy, you could do that. So either way will work just fine. The last thing I want to talk about is somebody earlier, they said like they asked a question like who created JavaScript or why is it so weird, and JavaScript has a very long history. It started in the 90s by Netscape. And it's funny that it's called JavaScript because it has absolutely no correlation to Java whatsoever. But I believe the reasoning that they made it called JavaScript was they wanted to entice Java developers into using JavaScript or something like that. But I honestly believe the actual inventor of JavaScript was just trying to see how many things he could get away with. And the answer to that question is a lot, because until very recently, JavaScript has been considered a toy language. You didn't do a lot of the stuff that you would do today. You wouldn't have done those things 10 years ago. You simply wouldn't. I mean, in fact, 10 years ago, you wouldn't even be for sure if every single browser supported JavaScript in the first place. But because it was invented, again, this is just my personal belief, I think this guy really wanted to have fun, or this team of people really wanted to have fun seeing all the kind of wacky sort of language constructs they could put together. And they came up with JavaScript, and it got past everybody because it was considered a toy. It wasn't really honestly looked at as a real programming environment for quite a long time. I do want to point out, though, that as wonky JavaScript is, does have a certain... Once you start getting a hang of it, it's just really interesting language. You wouldn't write code like you would in JavaScript in any other language, is basically what I'm saying. It's a very unique experience to learn. There are fewer similarities between JavaScript and Java than there are more similarities between JavaScript and Java than there are between C# and Java. But JavaScript is a very unique, interesting language that really changes the way you approach problems. And it's interesting, but it's also fairly wacky if you're not paying attention. So, as far as why hasn't JavaScript changed? Well, it actually has been a little bit. There's a lot of new things that have been added to JavaScript over the last few years, but unfortunately, because JavaScript is so ingrained in the web technology stack, there's no way that we can ever get away from it. It's going to be there forever, love it or hate it. Personally, I started to grow to like it myself the more I spent time with it, and the more, the more I started to grasp the interesting things that you do in JavaScript, like invoking functions right after they're defined, or writing functions that return functions and all that fun stuff. But again, it's very much a difficult thing to learn. So yeah, I hope everyone's following along all right. So with that, I think all the future people, I should say goodbye, because I will see you guys next week. So, goodbye.